I'm going to present some new evidence that Mathew Franklin Whittier, myself in the 19th century, and his wife Abby Poyen Whittier were the original authors of A Christmas Carol. Now, when I present evidence like this, you have to keep in mind that it's just one small part of a very large tapestry of evidence. And skeptics have a tendency to cherry pick and try to shoot down each individual piece of evidence individually. They're not interested in seeing the larger picture because they want to disprove it, and it's easier to divide and conquer for them. So, you can't convince cynics. You can convince skeptics because they want to know the truth. Cynics are exactly the opposite. They want to defend their position. They don't want to know the truth. They only pretend to be truth seekers. They're phonies to themselves and everybody else. So I'm not concerned with cynics who are trying to shoot down each of these pieces of evidence as though it stood alone, which it does not. This is extremely complicated. I'm going to have to go by my notes. It's going to be a little informal because I'm sure I'm going to stumble and, have to go back and so on, miss things. Some of it I can fix in editing, some of it I can't. It's going to take a while. If there's only 10 people that are interested enough to watch this now, and of those, 8 of them only watch the first 5 minutes, maybe there'll be people in the future that are taking this a little more seriously. So I will also present for them. Now, we have a certain work that I discovered in a book, a publication in England called Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine. They had a particular interest in science fiction, so they would publish fantasy science fiction type stories quite early. What I found was something called The Unbidden Guest. It appears in the April 1836 edition, and I do have a physical copy of that right here, which I will get into in a little bit. And it turns out that there's elements in that story that definitely seem to prefigure Charles Dickens' story called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole the Sexton. That's part of the Pickwick Papers. It was published in December of that year, so 8 months after this Unbidden Guest appeared. Now, the Unbidden Guest is signed Trismegistus. That's how I picked it up searching online. And Trismegistus was Mathew Franklin Whittier's pseudonym. He'd used it 4 times in 1828 in the New England Galaxy. He used it for a couple poems in the New York Transcript in 1835. All of that was his. He was writing for those newspapers. And here he is in Blackwood's in England in April of 1836 with the same signature. He would go on to bring back that signature in The Carpetbag in 1851, and the most popular characters in that newspaper in 1851, 1852 were a military caricature called Ensign Jehiel Stebbings, and then a caricature of academic philosophers and academia in general named Dr. E. Goethe Digg. Both were spin-offs from Trismegistus. Those were not written by Benjamin Drew, which is what the editor, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, asserted in his memoirs many years later. I pursued all of those lines of research. I'm stating my conclusions, but I have a huge amount of intensive research backing up each of these things. We don't have time to go back and prove that Benjamin Drew wasn't the author of Trismegistus. We don't have time to go back and prove that Mathew Franklin Whittier was the author signing Trismegistus and so on. I just have to assert these things. You can read my books and you can find all the evidence for them. So then there's another story which I've also presented. This is found in 1852, published by Francis Durivage. It's called The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. The story is the next to the last one. It's called The New Year's Bells, but almost with the exception of the title piece, The Three Brides, which is horrible, spiritually and emotionally horrible because this guy likes 3 sisters and he gets to marry each of them because each one dies in turn. See, that's Francis Durivage. He was a sociopath. Only a sociopath would think that was interesting, or funny anyway. Matthew wrote all the rest of them because Francis Durivage, with a partner, George Pickering Burnham, in early 1848, swindled Matthew out of his entire unpublished portfolio. I've determined this by a whole bunch of clues. I'm absolutely certain about it, but it's circumstantial evidence, but it's a vast amount of circumstantial evidence, including the fact that those two people couldn't possibly have written this material. If you look at a New Year's Bells, it's a precursor to A Christmas Carol. Very close similarities. And it's a redemption story, a spiritual redemption story. Durabaj was a sociopath. He couldn't have written it. It's impossible. Just like Charles Dickens, as a worldly man, couldn't possibly have written A Christmas Carol originally. So, I mean, there's certain self-evident things that people who are not spiritual can't pick up on because they don't have the ability, the discernment to pick up on these things. To a spiritual person, it's obvious, but to someone who's a materialist who hasn't awakened within him or herself spiritual discernment, it would seem plausible that Charles Dickens could have written A Christmas Carol, see, or that Durabaj could have written the New Year's Bells. Anyway, we've got these three pieces, and the more I look at the clues and try to figure out logistically, could this have led to that, and could that have led to that? What I find is that there has to be an instance of the New Year's Bells that was sent overseas by Mathew before 1836, and Dickens got his hands on it somehow. The reason I say that is because there are elements of both of these stories by Mathew in his story about the goblins and the Sexton. There's elements of The Unbidden Guest, and there's elements of the New Year's Bells, both in that story. He's borrowed from both of them. That means he had to have access to the New Year's Bells. The way that could happen, and Dickens was charged with doing this exact same thing in 1861 by somebody, you submit a story to a publication, and that publication, there's two ways it can happen. First of all, that publication folds, and the pieces that have been submitted to it, which were in a folder somewhere, in a file, are obtained by somebody else. Somebody buys out the publication and inherits all that stuff. I've seen that happen. It goes out to auction, maybe, goes out to yard sales or auction houses, and somebody gets hold of these manuscripts which were rejected by the publication for one reason or another and starts plagiarizing them or borrowing from them or taking ideas from them. This is summertime, so since this is Portland, I had a bunch of seagulls outside my apartment today, so I'm using my glass with a seagull on it. So what we're going to do is look at these three stories and look for common elements in them. And this is going to take some time, and it's going to be tedious and so on. Now, the most glaring similarity that we have here is that in the story of the Goblins Who Stole the Sexton, which was published in December 1836 as part of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens, his main character, his protagonist, is named Gabriel Grubb. Okay, and Gabriel Grubb is a sexton, and he runs afoul, and in the Christmas season, he runs afoul of a bunch of goblins and the king of the goblins. And the king of the goblins takes him mysteriously down into the earth and into a cavern, and there the goblins show him a series of projections, like movies or scenes or visions. And they're visions that transform him personally, and then he wakes up on the stone slab, the horizontal stone tomb that he was like to sit on and that he'd fallen asleep on. And maybe it was a dream, and maybe it wasn't a dream, and maybe he'd been drinking and so on. The ending infers all those things. But the visions that he has have to do with a happy family, and then the father is tired from work, and he comes home, and there's all his children and his wife, and everybody's happy. And then the next scene, the youngest child dies, and then there's a couple other scenes after that, of just a beautiful village and so on. And the goblins are trying to force a conversion of some kind on this grouchy, uncaring sexton, see? So it does seem to prefigure A Christmas Carol at several points. But those points are almost all in these two stories that he could have seen, theoretically anyway. One of them he definitely could have seen, The Unbidden Guest in Blackwell's in April April of 1836, Dickens almost definitely would have read that. See, so anything that's in The Unbidden Guest that appears in the story about the goblins and the sexton, we have to consider that he could have been influenced. The New Year's bells, that's a question. That's a gap in all this. We don't know for sure that Dickens could have seen that, but it certainly looks that way because Dickens' character, Gabriel Grubb, it sounds suspiciously like Matthew's character in the New Year's bells, who was named Israel Worm, W-U-R-M, Worm. So it's not much of a step from Israel Worm to Gabriel Grubb. Matter of fact, it's very suspicious. Okay, and that's one of the things that I hang this on. I wouldn't be so adamant about the fact that Dickens had to have seen the New Year's bells, except for this similarity in these two names. It's beyond chance, you know. He took something and he just modified it a little bit. He figured this is England, that's America, nobody's ever going to know. See? So that's the first thing. Now, in The Unbidden Guest, this is a story of a self-satisfied rich man who has lost all compassion for the poor. He seems like a nice guy, but he really doesn't care about anybody unfortunate, you know, the riffraff, see? And he's visited by this man who is a moocher and won't go away. He won't be refused entrance, and then he won't leave, and he eats him out of house and home. Turns out to be the devil. Well, I don't have to prove this story for Matthew because Trismegistus is his pseudonym, but Matthew wrote on this subject of boors and moochers many times, so it's typical for him. But then this fellow turns out to be the devil and chases him to a haunted cemetery where there are witches and skeletons and dancing goblins. Now, there are dancing goblins in Dickens' story about the sexton. Now, I don't know if there's German tales about dancing goblins. I don't know if that was a cliche that lots of people wrote about dancing goblins, but we definitely have dancing goblins here. So I'm going to look in my original here of The Unbidden Guest and read to you just a section about the dancing goblins. Here, in one place, a group of grinning hobgoblins were pirouetting and bobbing to each other and cutting such incredible capers that I can only compare them to those practiced in the Highland fling during the briskest paroxysms of that picturesque salutation, and so on. Now, let's look in Dickens' story, which I don't have an original of. I have it on my Kindle here. As the goblin laughed, the sexton observed, for one instant, a brilliant illumination in the windows of the church, as if the whole building were lighted up. It disappeared, the organ pealed forth a lively air, and whole troops of goblins, the very counterpart of the first one, poured into the churchyard and began playing at leapfrog with the tombstones, never stopping for an instant to take breath, but overing the highest among them, one after the other, with the utmost marvelous dexterity. The first goblin was the most astonishing leaper, and none of the others could come near him. Even in the extremity of his terror, the sexton could not help observing that while his friends were content to leap over the common-sized gravestones, the first one took the family vaults, iron railings and all, with as much ease as if they had been so many street posts. At last the game reached to a most exciting pitch. The organ played quicker and quicker, and the goblins leaped faster and faster, coiling themselves up, rolling head over heels upon the ground, and bounding over the tombstones like footballs. The sexton's brain whirled round with the rapidity of the motion he beheld. His legs reeled beneath him as the spirits flew before his eyes, when the goblin king, suddenly darting towards him, laid his hand upon his collar and sank with him through the earth. Now, let's see about this sinking through the earth business, because this also appears in Matthew's story. Remember, Dickens almost for sure would have read The Unbidden Guest. While Nick thus stood transfixed and spellbound, he saw, in a remote corner of the charmed semicircle, a man busy digging a grave, and throwing up at every lift of his spade a load that might have killed a dray horse. The sight of this figure, possibly mortal like himself, inspired him with sudden courage. His heart yearned towards him. In an instant he was by his side. But what words can express his rage, his loathing, his despair, when in his hideous lineaments he recognized his unbidden guest, that's already been identified as the devil. The fiend's eyes were fastened on him with the benumbing power of the basilisk, and, flinging aside his spade, while a ghastly grin wrinkled his countenance, he thundered in the burgher's ear, "Nick, welcome home!" Instantly the spell of silence that had so long hung like a heavy air over the charnel house was broken. The old church bell began tolling. Strange forms, apparelled in winding sheets, sung funeral anthems among the clouds, and while 1,000 infernal voices took up and prolonged the cry, "Welcome home," a legion of fiends, each as material as a Glasgow Bailey, gathering about the crazed burgher, made busy preparations for precipitating him into black abyss. But scared, distracted as he was, Nicholas was not the man to permit himself to be buried alive without a fight for it. A burgher at bay is a dangerous animal to meddle with, and accordingly he set to at the pugnacious imps with a skill and energy that might have created a sensation even at Mouselyhurst. But alas, what can one do against myriads? In vain Nicholas kicked, scratched, pinched, and even butted like a goat at his assailants. His strength was fast leaving him, and a sly, unhandsome blow in the sirloin, planted by his unbidden guest while he was manually reproving a squat goblin who had seriously inconvenienced him by the scandalous intemperance of his assault and battery, put an end to the engagement by sending him head over heels into the pit. Down, down he plunged, performing a world of grotesque gyrations in his descent, 10,000 lights flashing before his eyes, 10,000 bells ringing in his ears, owls hooting, fiends shouting, serpents hissing, cocks crowing, dogs barking, coffins crashing, ding-dong, whiz-whiz, bow-wow, cock-a-doodle-doo, bang, bang, huzzah, huzzah, and he himself shouting out louder than all, "Help, help, murder, thieves, fire, the devil, oh Lord," till he woke to find himself sprawling on the floor, and the cat, whom he had half crushed in his fall, mewing viciously, with her tail as thick as a bedpost, close beside him. So he wakes up from a dream, right? Let's go back to Dickens' story. The day had broken when Gabriel Grubb awoke and found himself lying full length on the flat gravestone in the churchyard, with the wicker bottle lying empty by his side, and his coat, spade, and lantern, all well whitened by the last night's frost, scattered on the ground. The stone on which he had first seen the goblin seated stood bolt upright before him, and the grave at which he had worked the night before was not far off. At first he began to doubt the reality of his adventures, but the acute pain in his shoulders when he attempted to rise assured him that the kicking of the goblins was certainly not ideal. He was staggered again by observing no traces of footsteps in the snow on which the goblins had played at leapfrog with the gravestones, but he speedily accounted for this circumstance when he remembered that, being spirits, they would leave no visible impression behind them. So both of them, it's inferred, had fallen asleep and had a dream. See, in Matthew's, it's definitely stated, and in Dickens, it's inferred. So we've got those parallels. And again, remember, Dickens would have read this. Okay, almost for sure, he would have seen it. Now, we go back to the New Year's bells, because there's elements in Dickens' story which also appear in here. Israel Worm falls asleep on a tombstone in the cold. And it's Gabriel Grubb had sat down on a horizontal tombstone and apparently fallen asleep there. So that's very much parallel with the New Year's bells. Again, we don't have proof that Dickens read this story, but it sure looks that way. In the New Year's bells, Israel Worm falls asleep on the tombstone. He meets a sexton during the summer, and he is shown a series of visions which transform him morally. Okay, so very, very similar to what we see in Dickens' story where the goblins show Gabriel Grubb a series of visions, right? Now, let's read a little bit out of here. The miser's path, a miser is Israel Worm, he's a landlord, lay through the churchyard, a desolate place enough even in the gay noon of a midsummer day, now doubly repulsive in the wild midnight of midwinter. The wall was ruinous, the black iron gateway frowned, naked and ominous. The field of death was crowded with headstones of slate, and innumerable mounds marked the resting place of many generations. The snow was now gathering fast over the dreary and desolate abode, as the miser stumbled along the beaten pathway, bending against the blast and drift. A strange numbness and drowsiness crept over him. He no longer felt the cold. An uncontrollable desire of slumber possessed him. He sat down upon a flat tombstone, just like we see in Dickens' story, and soon lost all consciousness of his actual situation. Suddenly he saw before him the well-known figure of the old sexton of the village, busily occupied in digging a grave. The winter had passed away. It was now midsummer. The birds were singing in the trees, and from the far green meadows sounded the low of cattle and the tinkling of sheep bells. Even the graveyard looked no longer desolate, for on many of the little hillocks bright flowers were springing into bloom and verdure, attesting the affection that outlived death, and decorating with living bloom the precincts of decay. And they go on. So he shows Israel Worm these scenes. Grove and schoolhouse passed away, melting into another scene like one of the dissolving views. But these look like a Christmas Carol because the first thing he meets is a childhood friend, okay, just like we see in A Christmas Carol. So there's elements in the New Year's bells that clearly seem to prefigure A Christmas Carol, but there's also elements that are seen in Dickens' story about the goblins and the Sexton, which is supposed to be his precursor to A Christmas Carol. So where there's similarities, I don't think we're seeing Dickens writing a precursor to A Christmas Carol at all. I think we're seeing Dickens influenced by two of Matthew's early stories and then reworking Matthew's manuscript, Mathew and Abby's manuscript of A Christmas Carol. It's not a precursor at all. It's just Dickens was borrowing from Matthew early, and then he was borrowing from Mathew and Abby later. Now, there's one scene in Dickens' story, the story of the goblins who stole the Sexton, that does seem to prefigure A Christmas Carol and does not seem to appear in either of these two earlier stories by Mathew. And that has to do with the father coming home to his family after work, and then the youngest child dying. But I think it's important we go back to that because I read that passage and it's phony. Okay, it's written by someone who is imitating something else, but who really doesn't believe in what he's writing. And this takes discernment. Okay, this takes spiritual discernment, which I've spent 50 years developing. Of course, there's no worldly credentials for that. My belt is JCPenney 398, But let me see if I can find this section. As the goblin said this, a thick cloud which obscured the remoter end of the cavern he'd taken him to down through the earth, rolled gradually away and disclosed, apparently at a great distance, a small and scantily furnished but neat and clean apartment. So he's now seeing a vision, a projection. A crowd of little children were gathered round a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown and gamboling around her chair. The mother occasionally rose and drew aside the window curtain, as if to look for some expected object. A frugal meal was ready spread upon the table, and an elbow chair was placed near the fire. A knock was heard at the door. The mother opened it, and the children crowded round her and clapped their hands for joy as their father entered. He was wet and weary, and shook the snow from his garments, as the children crowded round him, and seizing his cloak, hat, stick, and gloves, with busy zeal, ran with them from the room. Then, as he sat down to his meal before the fire, the children climbed about his knee, and the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. Now, this is very reminiscent of the scene in A Christmas Carol. Toward the end, the ghost of Christmas Future has brought Scrooge back to Bob Cratchit's house, and the scene is shown there of Mrs. Cratchit and the children waiting for Bob Cratchit to come home. He's tarried at Tiny Tim's grave, and so on. That's the part where I found a huge smoking gun, which suggests that Dickens hurriedly rewrote something and didn't pay much attention to what he was doing. Okay, I've gone into that in my paper and also in my book. I won't repeat that there, but that's very suspicious, that whole passage. So this seems to prefigure that. Now, when Dickens reworked Mathew and Abby's manuscript, he may have drawn from the story about the goblins and the sexton for this. You know, Mathew and Abby may not have had Bob Cratchit coming home from work, and Dickens may have decided to insert that from a story he'd written before. So it could be a precursor in that limited sense that he drew one little scene from it, you know. But so what we have here is that in the Goblins, and then immediately it switches to another scene where the youngest child is dying. So, you know, that also sounds like Tiny Tim, but it's kind of arbitrary, you know. So let me read that, and then I'll analyze it a little bit. But a change came upon the view, almost imperceptibly. The scene was altered to a small bedroom where the fairest and youngest child lay dying. The roses had fled from his cheek and the light from his eye, and even as the sexton looked upon him with an interest he had never felt or known before, he died. His young brothers and sisters crowded round his little bed and seized his tiny hand, so cold and heavy, but they shrunk back from its touch and looked with awe on his infant face, for calm and tranquil as it was, and sleeping in rest and peace as the beautiful child seemed to be, they saw that he was dead, and they knew that he was an angel, capital A, looking down upon and blessing them from a bright and happy heaven. Well, first of all, Charles Dickens was a worldly man. He didn't believe in heaven or angels or, you know, anything of that sort. He didn't believe in life after death necessarily. I think he was a skeptic about it. So he loved ghost stories, but he didn't, like a lot of worldly people, he didn't take it seriously. Secondly, anyone who studied real metaphysics and real occult teachings, the way that the kind of teachings that you see in A Christmas Carol, would know that upon dying, a person isn't automatically, instantly an angel in heaven looking down. Okay, that happens later. There's a transitional period, and we know that because we've read any number of near-death experience accounts where the person is first just floating above their body, just below the ceiling and looking on, and they might hang around the earth visiting people they knew and scenes that they knew for a couple, 3 days. And then they see a light, and they're drawn to the light, they go through a tunnel, and they emerge in the astral realm in heaven, where they're greeted by their loved ones and so forth and so on. And from there, after they acclimatize, they can look on the earth and see earthly scenes and so on. So this is clearly written by somebody that, first of all, wasn't really a Christian and didn't really believe these things, and secondly, had not studied occult teachings, which the authors of A Christmas Carol obviously had, because there's a great deal of authentic occult teachings in A Christmas Carol. So whether he's faking this out of his own mind or whether he's borrowing it from something else, we don't know, but it's not authentic. And in here, seized his tiny hand so cold and heavy. Well, that makes good theater, but a little boy who's just died, his hand is not going to be cold and it's not going to be heavy. Okay, either one. And they shrunk back from its touch. When you love somebody and you touch their hand after they've died, you don't shrink back in horror, you know? So he's writing, just like Edgar Allan Poe in his poetry, he's writing it in a sensational way without paying any attention to what he actually feels or what the reality of the situation would be. He's just writing for sensation. Okay? So that's not authentic, wherever it comes from. But it doesn't seem to come from The Unbidden Guest, published in April of that year, and it doesn't seem to come from the New Year's Bells either. However, there are places that in A Christmas Carol where Tiny Tim definitely could have come from. And that's what we're going to talk about now. This is the Boston Weekly Museum of 1850. This is the March 23, 1850 edition. In 1849 and 1850, this is 8 and 9 years after Abby had died, Mathew apparently prepared her stories for publication and published them posthumously under her maiden initials, AP, in the museum, which was a newspaper that he very frequently contributed to. So he didn't tell the editor, apparently. He let the editor think that this was an actual young woman from Worcester, Massachusetts, but he's submitting Abby's work posthumously. Now here we have what is the only essay by Abby in this series. I think it actually came from a letter. I think that Mathew excerpted a letter and turned it into an essay and submitted it for her posthumously. But Abby did a lot of charity work, and mostly it was with Irish immigrants. So an awful lot of the people that she worked with in her charity work show up in her stories. And this is no exception. And here is one example. She says, I always loved the story. She's talking about festival days and Thanksgiving in particular. I always loved the story, told so often, of a patriarchal country household where yearly on Thanksgiving Day there was spared a space and placed a seat at table for a dear child long dead, and the mirth was never so free, and songs never went out on the air so cheerily as then, when it was believed the small chair was filled, and the meek eyes of the spirit child looked in upon and hallowed all. Who knows that it was fancy? Thanksgiving was so like a spell, a watchword for the gathering of friends. How could they be in spirit so conjoined to him and yet be far away? So that's Abby Poyen Whittier writing about the customs of the people that she worked with in her charity work. Now, this is the 1850 volume of the Boston Weekly Museum, and I have to get a pillow, so hold on a second. I have to do my best to protect the spines on these things. This is a small table, and it's really not a big enough pillow, but it'll have to do for our purposes, as I like to say. I don't know if Mathew ever said that or not. I found that some of the funny expressions that I've always loved turn out to be Mathew's. Like, for example, I would say riz instead of risen. And Mathew did the same thing. Okay, there were 2 or 3 of them like that I've caught. So I don't know if he ever said porpoises for purposes or not. Now, this story is called The Sister Mary, and it appears in the October 26, 1850 edition. And this is about a little boy named Albert, I believe it is, Albert McFarland, who is slowly dying. He's an invalid, and he apparently had a fall when he was much younger, and it affected his spine, and he's kind of wasting away, and the whole family, even though they're very poor, they take very good care of him, and his sister is really practically a saint. Now, Abby was raised Catholic, so the Sister Mary is kind of a double entendre of, Mary and the Sister Mary, like a nun, but she's not a nun in this case. It's a rather saintly, plain, poor Irish woman, okay, who's, taking care of this little boy. She arranges for him to have medical treatment. She saves and saves and saves from her manual labor job, and she saves enough money to send him off for the water cure, and he's cured. That's the basic plot of the thing. It's very simple. It's a very short story, just a couple little chapters. But let me see if I can read something that gives you an idea of it. There he lay that Sunday afternoon, very patient and smiling as usual, And there, just within his reach, was the little shelf of books Mary had bought for him, and the pots of flowers on the window seat, and the canary, and the musical flute. But now, better than them all, Mary herself was there, and to be sure, such an atmosphere of health and freshness went about with her. The very sight of her, as she looked in at the door, drove his ailings far away. Some unusual light there was in Mary's face, too, just now, that drew attention from all, and that's because she has this idea for a cure, see? But that's little Albert. So there's another precursor. There are actually, I think it's 4 pieces that Abby wrote that have these child saint figures, kind of quasi-magical, saintly, slightly otherworldly children in them. And this particular one is sick. Not all of them are. But they all seem to prefigure Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol. So if there are elements that Dickens wrote himself in what people consider his precursor to A Christmas Carol about the goblins and the Sexton, there's much, much more in Mathew and Abby's work that functions as a precursor for A Christmas Carol. It would be like a scale of like 1 to 10 or something, in favor of Mathew and Abby's influence on A Christmas Carol compared to Charles Dickens. So that was basically what I wanted to present. Again, it's by way of sharing evidence. There's not enough in here to clinch it, and I admit that, although I have to say that the name Israel Worm sounds an awful lot like Gabriel Grubb. So somebody, I think, logically was imitating somebody. Now, what's the possibility that New Year's Bells was actually written after and influenced by the story of the goblins that stole a sexton? Well, by style, Mathew was writing science fiction, as one might expect, in his teens and early 20s. We're talking 1830 to 1835, somewhere in there. He was writing science fiction type fantasy stories that all had a moral. They were morals driven, but they were in that genre. And then he kind of got out of it for the most part. Occasionally he'd return to it, but he was heavily into that in the early 1830s. So I would say that the New Year's Bells is pretty typical for the kind of thing that Mathew was writing somewhere around 1832, possibly up to 1835, somewhere in there, the first half of the 1830s. So by style, I don't think this was written after December of 1836 when the Goblins and the Sexton was written. Goblins and the Sexton looks contrived. It looks like an imitation to me. It doesn't look like something that Dickens wrote out of his own heart and out of his own beliefs and his own experience. It looks like an imitation. And then there's the names. Then there's the fact that there's very strong evidence that there are elements in New Year's Bells which are repeated in A Christmas Carol. Now, whether Dickens could have done that directly or whether Mathew and Abby did that or some of both, we don't know. There's one other piece of evidence, and that is that back in 1826, and I have a physical copy coming in, I don't have it with me. Back in 1826, there is a story concerning the Barber of Göttingen, and it's signed by a modern Pythagorean. That's in, there's 3 stories that I believe Mathew wrote in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine in England in 1826 with this signature. There's one, The Man with the Nose, and then there's another one that I'm blanking on at the moment. Oh, it's the metempsychosis. That's the first one about reincarnation. So these were claimed by and claimed for a Scotsman named Robert McNish, who continued to write a bunch of stories under the pseudonym, apparently. But I am pretty darn sure, without being able to go into all of the evidence here, that Mathew submitted these stories when he was like 13 years old. And they're typical of what he could write at age 13. And then Robert McNish jumped on it and claimed the pseudonym and started imitating it, see, after that. But at least these first three were written by Mathew Franklin Whittier when he was 13 years old. And the reason that I go into that is because the Barber of Göttingen, however it's pronounced, has elements which prefigure the unbidden guest. And that is specifically, we've got this barber for the college, and after hours, he's getting ready to go home, and this fellow shows up and demands a shave. And he turns out to be kind of a supernatural character, very much like the unbidden guest. Doesn't say that he's the devil, but he's clearly supernatural, has supernatural strength and so on, and the barber can't refuse. So he starts to lather this guy up, and the lathering, for some unknown reason, goes on and on and on, and is never finished. And the man keeps saying, keep going, and goes on for hours and hours, and the lathering still isn't finished. Finally, the barber runs out onto like a ninth-story balcony, if there was such a thing in 1826. Anyway, a very high balcony, and he throws all of his tools over the edge. And so the guy that's getting shaved says, well, how would you like it if I threw you over the edge? And he grabs him by his nose and holds him over the edge. The nose falls off, the barber falls, and then wakes up in his own bed. So pretty darn close, There's the supernatural guy that won't be satisfied. There's turns out to be a devil-like figure. There's a fall, and there's a waking up, and it was all a dream. See? So, but when I look at all three of these pieces together, it's clear that they were written by Mathew Franklin Whittier and not this guy, Robert McNish. See? So we have, in 1826, we have Mathew apparently publishing in Blackwoods. So we know that he was publishing that early in 1826. Now, the reason I say that is that if he was submitting to a British journal in 1826 and getting published, there's no reason why he couldn't have submitted the New Year's Bells at some point around 1832, see, and not been able to get it published, and then Dickens got his hands on it. So it's plausible, And again, the reason it's more than plausible is specifically because of the similarities in name, because you've got this Gabriel Grubb, and then you've got Matthew's Israel Worm. Too close.